Marathon represents Bungie's first entirely new IP since Destiny, and because of that, its development cycles carries both a symbolic as well as a financial weight, particularly in the context of Sony's 2022 acquisition, as well as the broader push towards live service games in general. As its release draws near, I thought it might be useful to take a look at the current status of the game as well as how they managed to get here. And with its release, Bungie and more specifically Marathon has been posting lots of teasers, so it would indicate a very strong sentiment that no more delays, at least, are going to be happening, even with a recent delay of Bungie's Destiny 2 update. Now, as we know, Marathon was announced back in May of 2023, and it was during the PlayStation showcase that it was revealed. It was framed as a PvP extraction shooter set in a stylized and rather recognizable sci-fi universe, and at reveal, the positioning was very clear that Bungie was trying to leverage its reputation for tight gunplay as well as a competitive multiplayer design. At this stage, the expectations were very high. Bungie has credibility for its development on Halo as well as Destiny. Sony had publicly committed to expanding its live service portfolio, and Marathon was central to this strategy. However, the stability behind the scenes did not really remain intact. That was very clearly shown in the last few years that we've seen of this title. What I mean by this, back in spring in 2024, creative director at the time, Chris Barrett, was dismissed following a internal misconduct investigation. Barrett had previously been associated with major titles from Bungie, and his removal mid-development introduced uncertainty in the studio. And when leadership changes occur at this level, they rarely remain isolated events. They do tend to affect how aligned people are, how quickly decisions get made, and in general, how well the teams work together. The situation did take a turn when later Chris Barrett decided to build a lawsuit against Bungie and Sony as well. This brought the internal turmoil into the public domain. And even if the development continued, the public legality issues inevitably ended up putting more pressure. It did cause quite a distraction, as it would with any company. It ended up impacting them greatly, and no matter how big of a company you are, you will inevitably take some kind of blow from this. And we can see that from the recent developments from Ubisoft, where they have managed to cut their stock value in quite a large drop, essentially. Back in August of 2024, Bungie laid off approximately over 200 employees, which at the time was around the 17% of its workforce. And the reports indicated that Marathon was one of the projects affected by this layoff. These layoffs took place during a period of financial underperformance, with Sony publicly acknowledging that Destiny 2 had not met the set expectations that they wanted from this title. In December of 2025, the long-term art director Joseph Cross decided to depart the studio just months before the upcoming March 2026 launch. While core artistic direction is typically established well before release, the departure reinforced the broader narrative of leadership turnover during Marathon's development cycle. So, taken together, Marathon entered a rather high-pressure structural environment where a new IP was operating under financial scrutiny, and it meant that it had to navigate leadership changes and resulted in it being developed in a studio that had recently undergone a downsizing initiative. And this broader context is important when assessing subsequent delays and strategic recalibrations as well. Back in April of 2025, Bungie revealed gameplay and launched a closed alpha playtest as well for Marathon, and the initial player feedback was mixed to negative, to say the least. A recurring critique was that the gameplay loop just felt underwhelming and unbalanced. And it was just not captivating, especially compared to the level of fidelity that players have come to expect from the extraction shooter space. And in a genre where tension, pacing, and clarity, especially in terms of their identity, are quite central to long term player retention, the early perception carries a disproportionate weight, and the criticism at this stage was not necessarily that Marathon was broken. In fact, it was highly optimized, but just that it did not yet feel distinct enough. And shortly thereafter, Marathon faced quite a big controversy involving art assets that closely resembled work by the independent artist Anti-Real. Bungie described this situation as an internal oversight, and they later resolved this matter, probably by a settlement of some kind, as you would hope, because otherwise it would have done a large amount of damage to quite a wounded company already. However, while at the peak of the issue, it did add reputational friction during a rather crucial evaluation period. And so by mid 2025, the cumulative pressure, as well as the mixed alpha response, the public controversy, and ongoing leadership turnover created instability around the project's trajectory. And in June of 2025, Bungie announced that Marathon would be delayed indefinitely. Now, if we take an analytical standpoint, the delay can be interpreted as a strategic reset rather than a collapse. Extraction shooters rely heavily on retention curves and player confidence, and launching with a weak first impression can permanently impact the long term viability of a product. And we did see this quite recently with the launch of HighGuard, who just suffered a massive layoff of their workforce and is quite possibly only having a skeleton crew work on the game as of this moment. And this just comes to show that game development is quite fragile, and ultimately, who stands to lose if the game doesn't hit it off with the players? And that is obviously the people working on these games daily, and obviously not the higher ups who just greenlights any live service in hopes of hitting the jackpot with these. But I digress. Since the delay, Marathon appears to have undergone a rather measurable shift in player perception, and what initially faced criticism for uninteresting gameplay and originality concerns began to shift as Bungie showcased their new direction and systems that they have implemented. The delay provided additional development time for them, and so rather than pushing forward with a compromised launch, Bungie used the runway to refine systems and expand the content scope. They managed to clarify progression structures and adjust the pacing that previously had been the major criticism points. And so post delay messaging has emphasized features such as the proximity voice chat, the support for solo queue, the expanded gun customization, a fourth map at launch, the rank play, and a $40 price point. Now, individually, these systems are not necessarily revolutionary, but collectively, however, they suggest narrowing focus and a clearer systemic intent. It will be interesting to see how the $40 price point affects the player count, but I do think that with what Marathon has shown lately, I don't think it'll play that much of a negative for players. At least I hope that the game itself showcases the areas that might need work and not just let the price point or the price tag do all the negative feedback. Another noteworthy thing I want to mention is the fact that with the delay, they avoided a direct release collision with Arc Raiders, and it may have proven beneficial for them in the end, because in the extraction genre, early clustering of players could significantly impact the ecosystem stability. Although prominent figures departed during its development, the post-delay presentation suggests a much greater structural cohesion. Whether that cohesion reflects a deeper systemic refinement or improved communication will ultimately be determined through the open beta launch between February 26 and the 2nd of March. So despite the signs of recalibration, a structural risk still remain, and that is the fact that Marathon has experienced these leadership turnovers. They have experienced high-profile departures. They've undergone workforce reductions and financial scrutiny under Sony ownership. They have experienced early alpha skepticisms as well as reputational controversy. This means that Marathon isn't really launching in any kind of isolation. It exists within a broader narrative about Bungie's performance post-acquisition, as well as Sony's live service expansion strategy. And that context increases the perceived stakes and further increases the external pressures that they are finding them under right now. At the same time, Bungie retains their tangible structure advantages. The studio possesses industry-recognized gunplay expertise and have a long experience managing long-term live service ecosystems. Marathon also maintains a very distinct visual identity within the extraction shooter genre. So if the core gameplay loop proves genuinely satisfying, as well as the progression systems support a sustained replayability, Marathon has quite a credible path for a durable success. And extraction shooters do not require record-breaking launch numbers, to an extent at least. They require retention and identity clarity, competitive differentiation, systemic depth, and disciplined iteration on the product. So if the post delay can manage to build a meaningful pacing as well as reward structure and encourage a long-term engagement that players finds worthwhile, I could see that Marathon could potentially outperform its early perception, because there has been articles covering the alpha launch, and there was quite a big amount of players wanting to experience this game who unfortunately weren't allowed in. And so Marathon's development history reflects an incredibly high amount of volatility, with the leadership disruption, layoffs, controversy, skepticism, as well as the delay. However, the current trajectory suggests a product that has been strategically recalibrated and iterated upon rather than abandoned in any kind. The delay appears to have provided substantive development time rather than just superficial repositioning. There's been additions such as ranked play. They've expanded maps and made it clearer the systemic framing that would indicate a structural refinement. So whether this represents a genuine turnaround or simply a more polished surface will be determined by the open beta retention as well as the full launch performance of the game. But at present, Marathon should be viewed as a high risk and high important release for Bungie, one that will likely influence both the studio's strategic decisions and Sony's broader live service ambitions further on in the upcoming years. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I wanted to take a look at some of the most prominent episodes of Marathon's development, and I wanted to showcase as well how they managed to come through all these problematic situations that they surprisingly managed to find themselves in. And so that is going to do it all for me today, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and take care everyone.